Every year, the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences stages its yearly award show, colloquially known as the Oscars. The ceremony honors a selection of some of the prior year's best films and filmmakers. It's decided by members of the Academy, and it is usually one of the year's most watched events on television in the United States, often second only to the Super Bowl. The 2017 Academy Awards were especially memorable, in part because of a rather galling gaffe which occurred during the presentation of the award for Best Picture. It was a year in which the lineup of nominations for Best Picture stood out in large part because it featured a surprising amount of black talent. However, when it came time for presenters Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty to announce the winner of Best Picture, a moment of confusion erupted.
La La Land.
The presenters had initially been given a duplicate of the card for Best Actress, and La La Land was initially pronounced Best Picture. It took several minutes for the show's producers to hop on stage to announce the correction. In the time it took to sort out the confusion and correct the mistake, the La La Land team had finished nearly 3 speeches, leaving substantially less time for the cast and crew of Moonlight to make their own statements.
There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture. Moonlight, Best Picture.
The gaffe would have been embarrassing enough to all involved, as is, were it not for the racial politics surrounding both the 2017 Oscars and the 2 films involved in the gaffe. While La La Land had received many stellar reviews and awards, more than a few critics had commented on the film's problematic treatment of race and jazz. Some had criticized Gosling's character for serving as a white savior who sets out, in the words of Kelly Lawler, to, quote, save the traditional black music genre from extinction. End quote. Moreover, it did so in large part as a nostalgic emulation of MGM's classic musicals, a studio genre which was not particularly inclusive of non-white talent. As for Moonlight, it is only the second film helmed by a black director to be awarded Best Picture in the history of the Academy Awards. Reflecting on the gaffe, director Barry Jenkins later worried that, quote, in a slightly sinister way, the fuck-up confirms or affirms some people's unsavory thoughts about why the film was awarded Best Picture, unquote. That it won not because it is an exceptional film, which it is, but because it was a, quote, black film, and that the recognition was bestowed on the basis of some sort of presumed affirmative action rather than on the film's own merits. The incident was especially cringeworthy given that it followed in the wake of the Oscars So White hashtag campaign, which emerged when Twitter user and activist April Rain tweeted out, quote, Oscars so white, they asked to touch my hair, on January 15, 2015, in response to news that all 20 acting nominations for that year's upcoming Academy Awards had gone exclusively to white actors. The hashtag campaign continued into the next year, when it again became apparent that the Academy had nominated only white actors. Backlash ensued, and well-known black filmmakers and actors like Jada Pinkett Smith and Spike Lee boycotted that year's awards. The Oscars So White hashtag sought to draw attention to the long-standing disparities in awards recognition as well as the frequent sidelining of people of color in the Hollywood film industry overall. Indeed, even the sheer numbers bear this last point out, especially when looking at key vanity categories. By the 2022 ceremonies, only 5 black men have won Best Actor. Only 1 black woman, Halle Berry, took home the prize for Best Actress, and at a time when the press could hardly stop talking about her mixed black and white parentage in often troubling ways. Only a handful of black men and women have been awarded Best Supporting Actor or Actress. Only 2 pictures helmed by a black director, 12 Years a Slave and Moonlight, have won Best Picture to date, and those only in the last decade. No black person has won an Academy Award for Best Director. To put it bluntly, the Academy Awards seem to find it difficult to make room for a talented 10 black people, let alone a talented 10th. That the Academy should routinely overlook black talent is not especially surprising, given that its membership has historically been comprised, for the most part, of white men. While the Academy announced plans to invite a more diverse array of filmmakers and actors to join its voting body, and by 2020 seem to have made great strides in meeting their targets, there remain grave concerns about not only the inclusiveness of the Academy Awards, but Hollywood's broader racial politics. In this video essay, I will discuss not only key moments in which the Academy has chosen to bestow recognition on black talent, but also interrogate the roles and narrative formulas of the films in which they appear. As we shall see, Hollywood has a tendency to both cast and recognize black talent in a claustrophobically small universe of roles. The films in which they are embedded favor a relatively limited array of narrative habits and generic patterns. As such, Hollywood tends to produce and reiterate a fairly conventional set of racial images and imaginaries which, even when they appear flattering, may nevertheless have some problematic implications. As film scholar Frederick Gooding Jr. puts it in his own analysis of the Black Oscars, quote, "Black images canonized by the Oscars beg for further analysis and understanding as they reflect and reinforce race relations within mainstream society outside the theater." Given the history of racial representation on screen, there's really no surprise that questions about the role of racism in Hollywood's often problematic attempts to represent black life and recognize black talent should continue to haunt the movie business to this day. This is doubly important because much of the public's understanding of history is mediated through the prism of commercial media and movies that they consume. This is especially true when it comes to many white Americans' understandings of black people and black history, as the fallout of segregation ensures that many white Americans only really ever encounter black Americans on screen. Too often, Hollywood's racial fantasies seem to approach the troubled history of race in America in skewed, distorted, or even glamorizing ways, as if to suggest that racism can be remedied simply by projecting more images of a few carefully selected black people onto the silver screen, often without attending to the quality of those images or the larger contexts, myths, and narratives in which they are embedded. Of course, having black representation on screen is important. Even if the mere recognition of black exceptionalism cannot ultimately redress the ongoing history of anti-black racism, we nevertheless need much, much more of it. Simply having the chance to see black people on screen can have real meaning for individual viewers. However, the terms of black representation in Hollywood, and therefore recognition in the Academy Awards, are too often set by a white-dominated movie industry and may therefore come with troubling implications. Instead of playing along with the Academy Awards' own self-celebrations, I will push against the grain and reflect critically not only on the talent, but also the films they chose to honor. To achieve this, I will draw from critical work produced in the field of black studies, with a particular emphasis on scholarship frequently referred to by the umbrella term Afro-pessimism. This challenging body of work is valuable insofar as it allows us to illuminate what I, riffing off of phraseology advanced by Frank Wilderson III, will call the Ruse of Recognition. Wilderson's original terminology refers to what he calls the ruse of analogy, which broadly speaking refers to the tendency to compare or even conflate the particular positions and suffering of black people, or the black, in relation to other figures associated with oppression, such as the indigenous quote-unquote savage or the exploited worker. While such moves can appear as gestures of solidarity, Wilderson argues that attempts to dissolve or submerge the particular position and suffering of black people within these other categories ignores the meaning attributed as well as the gratuitous violence directed against blackness in the political ontology of modernity. The category and condition of blackness is not timeless or essential, but rather arises from the Middle Passage's transformation of African captives with a cultural identity, place in history, and sense of belonging in the world into slaves, shorn of all those relations, transformed from humans into mere objects or economic inputs, made tradable, usable, and infinitely exploitable, and thus rendered dead to the world. As Wilderson says, quote, "The ruse of analogy erroneously locates blacks in the world, a place where they have not been since the dawning of blackness. This attempt to position the black in the world by way of analogy is not only a mystification and often erasure of blackness's grammar of suffering, it is a mystification and an erasure because, whereas masters may share the same fantasies as slaves, and slaves can speak as though they have the same interests as masters, their grammars of suffering are irreconcilable." End quote. What Wilderson means to say here is that the condition of slavery which turned human subjects stolen from Africa into enslaved objects for the production of white wealth created a rupture so significant that it, quote, "destroys the possibility of ontology because it positions the black in an infinite and indeterminately horrifying and open vulnerability, an object made available, which is to say, fungible, for any subject." End quote. Not only are blacks therefore persistently marginalized and oppressed, they are routinely denied recognition as full human beings and thus liable to be raped, beaten, or killed without consequence at any moment. They are, in other words, constantly dehumanized and thus rendered as something other and less than human. Here again is Wilderson, quote, "Whereas humans exist on some plane of being and thus can become existentially present through some struggle for, of, or through recognition, blacks cannot reach this plane. The violence that continually repositions the black as a void of historical movement is without analog in the suffering dynamics of the ontologically alive." End quote. In this sense, then, what I am calling the Ruse of Recognition is not an entirely new concept, but is better understood as a subgenre of the Ruse of Analogy, one which serves the normative routines of highly mass-mediated liberal publics. Thinking through the notion of individualized recognition as a kind of ruse is useful in thinking through the often ignored social and cultural implications which arise from the bestowal of prestigious, highly coveted awards in the culture industries more broadly. Namely, the Ruse of Recognition implicitly conflates celebration of carefully selected handful of ostensibly exceptional black celebrities and artists with the overcoming or elimination of anti-black racism more generally. The Ruse of Recognition is a key strategy in the rhetoric of neoliberal post-racialism, as it seeks to convince audiences that the mere presence and success of a few high-profile black elites in fields such as acting, popular music, politics, and yes, even academia, can serve as a barometric indicator of either the retreat or total end of racism. If these few can make it, the logic goes, can't anyone? This assertion is belied not only by the continuing marginalization of black people more generally, but also the cultural ghettoization of popular black artists into an enclosed universe of highly stereotypical roles on the one hand, and the often abortive narrative horizons of the characters they play on the other. Far from indicating the event of a post-racial moment, the presence of a select few black faces on screen amounts to very little when set beside the ongoing fact of anti-black racism. In a sense, the Ruse of Recognition celebrates black exceptionalism or celebrity, not blackness as such, and stages award ceremonies both as legitimate moments in which black people may feel vicarious pride, but which are always in some sense tarnished by a certain kind of parasitic erasure or occlusion. Indeed, the recognition of celebrities may serve as a double-edged sword, insofar as it may be deployed in bad faith to short-circuit critique or delegitimate the grievances of ordinary black people. It may even work to assure naive but otherwise well-meaning white audiences that racism simply isn't such a big deal anymore, rather than kind of thinking of it as a structurally endemic to the historical production and reproduction of the modern world. The Ruse of Recognition, in other words, seeks to palliate the structural and cultural violence of a world suffused with anti-black racism through spectacles of celebrity accompanied by a discourse of black exceptionalism. By training my attention on the routines by which this ruse operates, my goal is decidedly not to adjudicate the worthiness, performance, or talent of black celebrities or filmmakers, nor is it to engage in speculations about their relative ability to authentically estimate some impossible aggregate called black lived experience in which I do not and perhaps cannot participate. Rather, it is in the first instance to foreground a body of theoretical discourse conducive to the analysis of the particularities, feints, and disguises of anti-black racism in the neoliberal moment, and, secondly, to deploy this framework to unravel the strategies and structures of a white-dominated, only ostensibly progressive institution of cultural production and prestige, as well as the racial imaginaries which they are in the business of manufacturing and advertising. Hollywood's function is precisely to project captivating fantasies which legitimize and reproduce the hegemonic common sense of civil society. The Academy Awards are therefore more than a vacuous yearly ritual which bedazzles audiences with star power beamed directly to their boob tubes. They are also a legitimizing appendage to Hollywood. It is thus only rarely that the Academy Awards reflect critically upon commercial cinema's most ingrained habits, let alone the meager scope of the anointed few who receive notoriety for participating in the reproduction thereof. Before we continue, it's worth taking a moment to expound upon the often misunderstood and in fact quite diverse body of work which flies under the flag of Afro-pessimism. The term functions as an umbrella category, which denotes a pretty sophisticated set of theoretical propositions and a diverse range of not always commensurate positions amongst the participants involved in the elaboration and adjudication of its discourse. Some critics of Afro-pessimism have either willfully or unintentionally mischaracterized this body of scholarship, and indeed the moniker pessimist makes it a somewhat easy target to caricature. We should be particularly wary of dishonestly reductive readings of this scholarship, especially at a time when right-wing provocateurs have taken to manufacturing a moral panic over a grossly distorted caricature of critical race theory, as well as the teaching of history of race more broadly. Just another example of the ways in which white-dominated civil society perpetually suppresses and erases black critique. In general, Afro-pessimists are skeptical about claims that black liberation either has been or can be achieved, especially under the role of a bourgeois liberal Enlightenment humanism which, in spite of its universalist pretensions, regards itself either as implicitly or explicitly white in both origin and application. They are also pessimistic about the emancipatory claims, and thus utility, of critical frameworks such as gender critique or Marxism, given that the structure of black oppression cannot be analyzed to other modes of oppression. Anti-black racism must be treated on its own terms, rather than integrated into and instrumentalized for the political agendas of others. Afro-pessimists thus focus on the master-slave relations upon which white Europeans constructed their ostensibly enlightened social relations and political identities, noting that the freedom, comfort, and economic development enjoyed over the course of nearly 400 years by generations of white Americans and Europeans rested, and still often rests, on some form of enslavement of black people. Slaves were systematically represented as less than human, inherently inferior, incapable of civilization, and ultimately expendable. Since the category of slave has been so long synonymous with black in the imaginations of those who believe themselves to be white, black bodies are often rendered as mere flesh, more on the order of animal stock than sentient and equal human beings. Thus the figure of the black, understood as the perpetual slave, became the constitutive other, upon which and against which white civil society erected its own sense of freedom. Blackness thus became and remains paradigmatically coterminous with slaveness, while liberty and freedom are constructed as inalienably and normatively white. In this sense, the non-human black slave serves as the pre-ontological bedrock, or slab-on-grade foundation upon which the master's house is erected. This condition continues to haunt the lives of black people, who long after the supposed moment of emancipation continue to be treated as perennial outsiders or aliens within, relegated to an excluded and permanently dishonored category of beings against which white European masters have historically defined themselves. Moreover, it is also the means by which white society has secured the wealth which guaranteed its freedom, whether through the exploitation of black labor, or the appropriation of black culture, but ultimately upon the fungibility, financialization, and ultimate expendability of black people themselves.
Splendid seeing you, sir. What catches your fancy? This lounge is very brawny, yeah?
How much are the ones Platt and Eliza?
After all, if enslaved peoples are just property, then they are by definition objects, and thus other than human. As mere objects or flesh, masters had a right to do what they would with them. Slaves were often viewed at best as assets, capital investments, which could be kept up as a form of machinery or put up as a collateral to insure a debt, and at worst as fleshy dolls, exploited as sex toys or even just murdered for sport by those who believed themselves to be white. As mere property, they had no recourse to laws which protected their bodily autonomy, right of contract, or other basic human rights. In this sense, the enslaved were not only objectified in the eyes of the law, but also, as sociologist Orlando Patterson put it, socially dead. That is, permanently dehumanized and denied both civil protections and entry into civil society. In that sense, anti-black racism is non-analogous to forms of oppression or regimes of violence such as class exploitation, sexual repression, gender regulation, and so forth, as these forms of oppression are not as total as the void which constitutes the socially dead being. The worker, for example, might find his labor exploited and the fruits of his work alienated. The black, on the other hand, is inherently fungible. The slave's labor cannot be exploited because she is not seen as a free agent renting out her time, but rather as property. Her work product cannot be subject to alienation because the social order has already alienated her so completely from herself. She is considered biologically alive, but legally dead. Thus, the slave is so thoroughly depersonalized that the violation of her mind or body in the form of assault, rape, or death are considered no violation at all. The notion that this condition remains central to the modern epoch, that is, in a sense, we live not in a post-racial era, but rather in the afterlife of slavery, is a central observation of Afro-pessimism. While slavery may be impermissible as a legally sanctioned form of economic relation, its afterlives persist and reverberate in both the marginalized socio-political and economic status afforded black people, as well as the psychosocial and cultural compulsions through which that status is rendered legible and perversely justified. And indeed, even after the advent of so-called emancipation, black people faced the perpetual risk of being arrested on trumped-up charges such as vagrancy and re-enslaved. They were routinely segregated and denied benefits extended to white people in ways that made it nearly impossible to participate in the accumulation of intergenerational wealth. They were denied the right to vote, often through explicitly violent means. And to this day, black neighborhoods are routinely over-policed, and black people are routinely incarcerated at higher rates and face longer prison sentences than whites even when they commit similar offenses. Even to this day, black people remain the targets of unscrupulous financial practices, as evidenced by the subprime mortgage crisis. Anti-black racism in this sense denotes the practices and processes which have pigeonholed black people into a category of generally dishonored beings who are considered less than human and can therefore be demeaned, violated, re-enslaved, left for dead, or even gratuitously murdered. As Sadie Hartman puts it in her book, Lose Your Mother, quote, "If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment." Or, as Christina Sharp puts it in her book, In the Wake, quote, "The contemporary condition of black life is lived near death, as deathliness, in the wake of slavery," end quote. Here, the notion of the wake should evoke several different meanings all at once. The wake as a funeral vigil or death watch, as the turbulence left in the wake of a ship, such as a slave ship, and the emergence from a dream or of waking up and coming to political consciousness. Sharp's notion of living in the wake is particularly interesting because it denotes the ways in which blackness, while defined by proximity to death, is nevertheless also defined by practices of resistance, critical study, and communal care, which may be at once extraordinary and quite mundane. Yet even experiences of black joy and resistance are not immune to institutional and commercial co-optation. It's no secret that the American culture industries often appropriate black cultural production in order to make profit. Indeed, even black pride is often co-opted while black people are screened as props in materialistic fantasies used to promote brands, initiate fashion trends, and promote lifestyles to middle-class white and black consumers alike, rendering black culture fungible and putting it to work for purposes of capital accumulation, the ill-gotten gains of racial capitalism. Nowhere is this more noticeable than in the domain of cinematic representation.
And the Oscar goes to Halle Berry in Monsters Ball.
The 2002 Academy Awards show is often referred to as the Black Oscars for bestowing its recognition on Denzel Washington and Halle Berry for Best Actor and Best Actress respectively, as well as for honoring Sidney Poitier with a Lifetime Achievement Award. While many hailed the event as a turning point in the industry's recognition of black talent, others have expressed worry about the problematic racial politics of the films and roles for which Washington and Berry were celebrated. As film critic Jared Sexton puts it, quote, "While many were glad to have swept the Oscars and felt pride at the momentary disruption of Hollywood's consistent marginalization of black actors and actresses, a pressing concern about the sort of message that their respective roles might deliver accompanied any pleasures of recognition. After all, Berry is cast as a poor and widowed black woman whose desire for the affections of an unbelievably reformed racist prison guard is matched in intensity only by her ability and perhaps willingness to bracket out the fact that he's also her formerly imprisoned husband's executioner, a feat undertaken while coping with the grief of her only son's recent accidental death. Washington, for his part, as Detective Alonzo Harris, veritably embodies the dark side of contemporary urban law enforcement, cast as an unscrupulous rogue cop whose singular ferociousness and ultimately incompetent scheming seems to absorb the corruption of the entire Los Angeles Police Department, highlighting and absolving a racist city power structure in one breathtaking gesture. While a small group of black celebrities like Washington and Berry are rewarded with wealth and stardom, their success seems to hinge upon a deal with the devil. High-profile roles offered to black people often comprise a small, suffocating universe of frequently demeaning stereotypes which subtly but decisively reiterate white supremacist logics. Or, as Sexton, quoting the work of film scholars Ellis Cashmore and Jesse Rhines puts it, quote, "When blacks do participate in the mainstream film industry as actors, they've been permitted access only on the condition that they conform to whites' images of blacks. When black creative talents find themselves in positions behind the camera, they have tended to act precisely as whites have in similar circumstances. Such is the price of the ticket. Black film, white money." End quote. In effect, the heightened vulnerability of black lives to violence and imprisonment has as its correlate the representational violence and cultural enclosure propagated by the film industry. One way in which this condition might be said to manifest itself is in the observation that black actors are often recognized when they play the role of slaves, or when they play roles which conform to commonplace stereotypes in typical urban settings, or when they affirm white audiences were suspicions of black people, going so far at times as to perversely rewrite the demand for social justice as a paranoid play for power. Still other roles seem carefully designed to paper over the troubled history of racial violence in America altogether, putting white audiences at ease as to the ostensible progress made with regards to race relations. Consider, as an example, the very first black performer to win an Academy Award, Hattie McDaniel, who won the award for Best Supporting Actress in 1940 for her portrayal of the loyal slave Mammy in Gone with the Wind. Mammy is a loyal house slave and sticks by her mistress even after emancipation, thus in a sense papering over the troubled history of post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction American history, a period which was absolutely rife with lynchings and other forms of white supremacist terror. Indeed, the film has been heavily criticized for whitewashing the experiences of the enslaved, romanticizing life on antebellum plantations, and confirming a lost cause mythology which paints the antebellum plantocracies of the South as glamorous and idyllic, rather than as what they were, places suffused by terror, in which the threat of violence, whether latent or manifest, suffused nearly every aspect of daily life. Even if we leave aside the deeply mythologized image of Southern life the film constructs, it's noticeable that Hattie McDaniel's role as a maid was pretty common in 1940. In fact, this is one of the very few roles in which audiences expected to see black women. In this sense, Octavia Spencer's win for Best Supporting Actress for The Help in 2012 in some sense gestures not so much towards progress, but rather a seizing up or suspension of temporality, a still frame upon which the film roll of history freezes indeterminately, showing just how little progress Hollywood has made when it comes to the representation of black women on screen. As media studies scholar Frederick Gooding Jr. puts it, quote, "It is a false debate to quibble about whether Hattie McDaniel or Octavia Spencer played the role of maid with dignity and aplomb. Performing a subjugated role with dignity is perhaps optimistic in some respects, but it is objectively unthreatening to the status quo." End quote. Something similar is at work, I think, in Denzel Washington's Oscar for Training Day, which was won for his masterful performance of corrupt cop Alonzo Harris, a figure who literally terrorizes the communities which he is ostensibly tasked with policing. The film is not only troubling for its insistence on advancing a bad apples theory of police corruption, but also for investing that corruption in the figure of arguably the most well-known black celebrity working in the film business today. Or, as Jared Sexton succinctly puts it, rendering, quote, "the racial coding of state violence as black." End quote. By dissolving and thus absorbing the LAPD's history of endemic and aggressive over-policing within the central figure of Alonzo Harris, the film seems to confirm white suspicions that the troubles plaguing black communities are, indeed, the fault of individuals belonging to those communities. As such, the role papers over the longer history of racial segregation and social abandonment, which ethnographic glimpse into the dark underbelly of LA. Some have speculated that Washington's Oscar for Training Day was offered up not necessarily for his role as Alonzo Harris, but rather in belated recognition for his role in Spike Lee's 1992 biopic, Malcolm X. Others think that Washington had lost the Oscar for Malcolm X not because his performance was inferior to that of Al Pacino's in Scent of a Woman, but rather because the historical figure and character of Malcolm X was simply too controversial for the Academy, underscoring liberal Hollywood's fundamental discomfort with the politics and history of black radicalism.
Oh, I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok. This is what he does.
This is especially so in the wake of the outraged riots which followed on the heels of a jury's acquittal of the LAPD for the vicious beating of Rodney King, which was caught on tape and broadcast widely across the country, the footage of which Spike Lee included in the film's opening credits.
You're not an American, you are the victim of America. You didn't have a choice coming over here. He didn't say, black man, black woman, come on over and help me build America.
In many ways, the Rodney King tape was not only timely, but fateful, insofar as it presaged the slew of citizen-produced smartphone videos which would later help galvanize the Black Lives Matter protests 20 years later. At the same time, however, one wonders about the degree to which such footage has merely been assimilated into the circuits of racialized spectacle. To borrow the words of Saidiya Hartman, one must wonder about, quote, "the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated, the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequences of this routine display of the slave's ravaged body. Rather than inciting indignation, too often they immure us to pain by virtue of their familiarity, especially because they reinforce the spectacular character of black suffering." End quote. Indeed, even movies produced as biopics seem to reproduce narrative tendencies which bring troubled young men in urban neighborhoods to their ultimate demise, such as the cycle of so-called hood films which became popular over the course of the late 1980s and 1990s. These films served largely as cautionary tales, and thus fit quite comfortably in traditions of Hollywood films which position themselves in a didactic or pedagogical orientation to white audiences, teaching them that hate is self-destructive, even as it takes a more disciplinary or almost carceral tone in its address to non-white audiences, threatening them with incarceration or even death if they don't quit their presumed gang-banging ways. It is in fact this kind of logic which authorizes instances of police brutality, even as it reinforces the notion in the minds of young black men and women that white society will not only always blame them for their own victimization, but will always presume them to be born criminal and therefore police them regardless of their personal choices, even unto death. After Hattie McDaniel, a black actor wouldn't be awarded an Oscar again for nearly 25 years, until Sidney Poitier won Best Actor for his work in the 1963 comedy Lilies of the Field, A film which, far from brutalizing its main character, nevertheless flattens it out in another troubling way by offering him up as an ultimately wholesome, hard-working paragon of morality and virtue. It was, in a sense, a feel-good role in a film meant to submerge Americans in a warm, comfortable fantasy about race relations at precisely the moment when the nation was in fact deeply uneasy, radically torn, and even in violent upheaval on the subject of extending civil rights, protections, and basic liberties to African Americans. Indeed, in many ways, the film illustrates one of the strategies inherent to what I am calling the Ruse of Recognition, namely the ability of sentimental commercial culture to offer up white fantasies of universalism as a stand-in for black liberation. Indeed, the Academy's decision to bestow a Lifetime Achievement Award on Portier during the Black Oscars in 2002 could easily be read as delayed recognition for the slew of edgier dramatic roles the legendary actor played over the years, especially in films which made at least some pretension to social commentary, including The Defiant Ones, A Raisin in the Sun, In the Heat of the Night, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. While such films dealt much more directly with the issue of race relations, they are problematic not only for their tendency to eschew structural historical treatments of racism and instead locate racism in individual characters' attitudes, personal prejudices, and bigotries, but also for relegating Portier to roles which either highlight middle-class black respectability, or as characters tasked directly or indirectly with converting racist white characters. Even Portier himself would at times become exasperated with a Hollywood press corps which seemed almost obsessively intent on pressing him into a racial box, boiling his identity down to his blackness and treating him as Hollywood's go-to spokesperson for all things related to civil rights and race relations.
Why is it that you guys are hounds for bad news? You know, it seems to me that at this moment, this day, you could ask me many questions about many positive and wonderful things that are happening in this country. But you sit here and ask me such one-dimensional questions about a very tiny area of our lives. You ask me questions that fall continually within the Negro-ness of my life. I am artist, man, American, contemporary. I am an awful lot of things, so I wish you would pay me the respect due and not simply ask me about those things.
No doubt, Portier's frustration stems in large part from the press corps' inability to see him as anything other than black, to see him as a full human being. The presumed and problematic assumption, of course, is that it's somehow the job of black artists and filmmakers, and by extension black people, to air their pain and rehearse their traumas or tragedies in a bid to educate largely white audiences about the history of white supremacy. This is in turn achieved through the conversion of white protagonists who start off as racist, but over the course of their relationship with black supporting characters, learn the error of their ways. The implication is troubling. Such films often presume that it is the function of black characters, and by extension, the job of black people, to convert white racists. These narratives often enact dramas of racial reconciliation, which work relentlessly to redeem white characters, and often to humble otherwise exceptional black characters.
Oh, boy. Man, you're just like the rest of us. Ain't you?
Essentially, black characters become a means through which white characters can accomplish an almost spiritual redemption, while white audiences get the pleasure of seeing black self-righteousness brought low. Moreover, they often kill off their black characters, treating them as sacrificial lambs for the salvation of white characters' soul, as well as the moral edification and, it must be said, entertainment of majority white audiences. In Hollywood films, the role of black characters is to help white leads or co-stars overcome their racism. That's basically the message. Such as Sidney Poitier's character, Virgil Tibbs in The Heat of the Night, a film which helped to establish the convention of the mismatched interracial buddies so commonly seen in cop films. Similarly, Halle Berry won her Oscar for playing Letitia, a role made famous in large part because of the controversial, almost pornographic sex scene in which she quite literally fucks the racism out of Billy Bob Thornton's character, Hank. While the interracial romance which ensues propels Hank's character down a redemption arc, which ends with him denouncing his racist father and shacking up with Letitia, the film produces a much more ambiguous conclusion for Letitia, who chooses to silently forgive Hank even though she discovers that he has been hiding from her the fact that he was present at her husband's execution. While Letitia ultimately reconciles herself to her new place in Hank's home, the film first has to lay waste to her family and throw her out of her own house to get her there. Hank rescues Letitia from homelessness and working-class poverty in a way which indirectly establishes him as an unlikely white savior, but only after the film has run her family through the gauntlet of highly predictive narrative pathways including deprivation, depredation, incarceration, and death. Letitia is not redeemed so much as she resigns herself to slightly more bearable but perhaps still implicitly carceral condition of domestic dependency. When black characters are given redemption arcs, it's often because the film tries to establish an equivalence between white racism and black prejudice. Films such as Green Book, for example, frame the historical figure of Donald Shirley as an arrogant, out-of-touch elite who looks down on the ostensibly alien working-class culture of his Italian-American driver, Tony Villalongo. Both characters reach a state of mutual understanding which bridges both the racial and class divide, but to achieve this, the film has to largely elide the overlapping but very different structural conditions which define and reproduce inequalities in terms of class and race in the first place. Personal reconciliation is introduced as a sentimental stand-in for social justice, which the film ultimately sidesteps to an emphasis on overcoming individual prejudice. Thus, Hollywood films about race relations often tend to follow two rather formulaic pathways. Either they swap out thorny questions of social justice and structural inequality for sentimental fantasies of reconciliation and individual redemption, or they reiterate long-standing cultural expectations which naturalize incarceration or violent death as the ultimate horizons of black life. Not infrequently, they build the former outcome upon the back of the later. Many viewers will get to this point and say, sure, Hollywood and the Oscars have a tarnished history, but hasn't there been real progress in terms of black representation in Hollywood? After all, although Cynthia Erivo was the only person of color nominated in the acting category in 2020, it was for her portrayal of abolitionist Harriet Tubman in Kasi Lemon's biopic Harriet. Doesn't that count for something? Indeed, the following year included a longer roster of nominations, with Daniel Kaluuya winning Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal of Black Panther Fred Hampton in Judas and the Black Messiah. Isn't that progress? In one sense, sure, of course. But while institutional recognition for films' treatment of exceptional yet frequently overlooked and even unduly demonized black leaders is important, they nevertheless do not constitute a radical break with so much as a slight revision of Hollywood's habits. The potential pool of black roles and characters remains relatively small. Moreover, narrative conventions continue to reinscribe death as the ultimate horizon of black life. The roles have become nobler, and those deaths may seem more unjust and tragic, but the facts remain. Indeed, even films focusing on the lives of exceptional civil rights icons may inadvertently naturalize black martyrdom as a necessary and predetermined, if regrettable price for black liberation, when in fact such deaths are the totally contingent, highly quotidian, and completely avoidable outcome of anti-black racism and white supremacy. While many of these films work to recover the too often disregarded or repressed histories of black freedom struggles in American history, they also frequently dramatize or culminate in spectacles of violence rained down on black bodies in order to spark sympathy or outrage. Although the movie business reproduces problematic racial outcomes both on screen and off, it does so not because of some nefarious intent on the part of the Academy or Hollywood filmmakers more generally, but because of tendencies that are seemingly so deeply ingrained in both American history and its most time-honored storytelling practices as to appear both largely natural, even accurate, and therefore unavoidable. If black characters are plagued by an alarming amount of death on screen, it is ultimately because our media cultures, not to mention economic and political institutions, seem to have great trouble imagining stories that play out otherwise. Indeed, even an unscripted occurrence at the 2022 Oscars risked affirming troubling and long-standing stereotypes about black masculinity, not to mention thin-skinned celebrities. When Will Smith, just minutes before receiving his own Academy Award for his role in the biopic King Richard, slapped presenter Chris Rock for a joke the comedian had made about his wife's haircut. Will Smith offered a tearful apology to the Academy during his acceptance, but also implied that his actions were in the spirit of the biographical figure he won that award for playing.
Richard Williams was a fierce defender of his family. Art imitates life. I look like the crazy father, just like they said. I'm being called on in my life to love people and to protect people.
One wonders about the degree to which art not only imitates, but also helps to dictate the terms upon which life is lived, especially black life, especially in a country which seems so totally enamored with its own most ambivalent fantasies, as well as the hard-won achievements of its most celebrated icons, that it forgets that, more often than not, America remains a place not of constantly expanding, but often contracting opportunity, where social mobility is becoming increasingly harder, and the majority of great dreams go unrealized. And where sometimes certain dreams are not even recognized as being worthy of having in the first place. Hollywood may inspire, but even that inspiration may work double time as a distraction. Cinema can illuminate, but turn away from the dream screen to look back into the projector beam, and you might find it a blinding experience as well. As Wesley Morris of the New York Times put it, quote, "Watching Smith up there on Sunday, burying his behavior in the Williams' story, I'm not sure he was entirely back in his body. I've never experienced a victory that feels this much like defeat. I suspect he knew this too. He wondered whether he'd ever be invited back. That feels right. He wasn't accepting an Oscar so much as trying to turn himself in." As one of the viewing public's most popular pastimes, and a formative maker of not just American but increasingly global culture, Hollywood cinema has long adjudicated ordinary people's understanding of history. However, the versions of history which Hollywood routinely constructs are almost always highly mythologized and deeply melodramatic in their orientation, and perhaps we shouldn't expect otherwise. Hollywood has no fiduciary duty to aspire towards either historical accuracy or sober self-reflection. Although Hollywood is frequently besmirched in the press for its presumably elitist liberal leanings, the fact is that the film business remains first and foremost a business, and it is thus relatively conservative, preferring tried-and-true formulas over radical departures. Large amounts of money go into the production of movies, and investors expect returns on their investment. It might be too much to expect the cultural produce of those investments does anything other than legitimate the presumed fundamental rightness of the economic systems from which it arises. When great films do manage to step outside of these formulas, they are often shunted because of it. For example, some younger members of the Academy have speculated that although Jordan Peele's Get Out received several nominations and took home the Oscar for Best Screenplay, it would have done much better had older voting members of the Academy even bothered to watch it in the first place. To come around full circle, one of the reasons why Moonlight was such an Oscar-worthy movie is that it so deftly navigated its main character around so many of Hollywood's most typical narrative pitfalls. By querying the conventions of the hood film, it sought to do justice to the complexities of blackness without terminating in either Black Death, and without submerging the difficulties of the lives it depicts in fantasies of a post-racial reconciliation or a morality play of criminal comeuppance. However, Moonlight's excellence also made the 2017 Oscar gaffe both that much more troubling and at the same time that much more predictable. Even when it attempts to break the mold and celebrate black film, Hollywood seems unable to resist its compulsive preferences for appropriating and sanitizing the accoutrements of black culture for the production of white fantasy, pleasure, and prestige. To their credit, the team of La La Land eventually ceded both the stage and trophy to Moonlight with some degree of grace. But this is ultimately a story not of individual actions so much as scandal on an industrial level. If the incident remains an embarrassment, It also stands as a dramatic performance in which white commercial culture steals the show. The 2017 gaffe is a purloined moment, one in which Hollywood itself, that self-styled bastion of cultural liberalism and pillar of cultural excellence, takes the stage and plays up its fundamental and charitable goodwill in its dealings with blackness. Just another stellar performance in which Hollywood gets to congratulate itself for transforming yet another moment of racialized plunder into a spectacle of black sacrifice, white redemption, and racial reconciliation. The statue passes hands, the lost time goes unredeemed, and the show goes on.